In this video, we are going to talk about one of the last differences between different ways of creating variables using var, let and const. I don't know if you have noticed, but in my previous videos on this topic, I was always using var to create the variable. And it was totally intentional because there is a slight behavioral difference between how var, let and const creates the variable. In this video, we'll try to understand that. So if you look at the example here, you can see that we are defining three different variables: username, number, and pi. And one important thing to notice is we are using all these three variables on top before defining it. We have also understood the concept of hoisting, and hoisting occurs because of declaration mode that execution context goes through. So now let's go ahead and try to understand how var, let and const is going to behave a bit differently. So we'll start creating the execution context, and you can understand this is the global execution context that gets created whenever you're executing any piece of code. Right now it is in declaration mode. On line number 1 we can see console.log. It is neither a variable declaration nor a function declaration, so I'll skip line number 1, move on to line number 2. Because we are in declaration mode, we'll skip this line also because this is a function call. Same is the case with line number 3. So we'll move on to line number 5. On line number 5, what we see is a variable declaration named username with the keyword var. And whenever you create the variable using the var keyword, it does two things that we have learned earlier. The first thing it does, it will create a new box, and the name of the box is going to be username. So first thing var does is to create a box with the name username. The second thing it does is to initialize the box with a value that is undefined. So var does two things in declaration mode. It creates the box with the name and initializes the value with undefined. So this process is done. Let's move on to the next line, that is line number 7. And we are creating another variable, number, using the keyword let. So let's see what let does. So let will again go ahead and create a box. And the name of the box is number. But what is the value inside number in declaration mode? And that is the main difference we need to understand. Whenever you create a variable using var, the first thing var does is to create a box, and the second thing it does is to initializes the box with the value undefined. But when it comes to let and const, it just creates the box, that is the first thing it does, and it doesn't initializes the box at all. So you can understand that let and const only creates the box, it doesn't initialize the box. But you must be thinking, why does it matter initializing the box or not? So for that, we need to understand this part. You cannot use a variable that is not initialized. And this is the rule that we need to follow. You cannot use it. So let's just try to keep these things in mind and try to understand what is going on here. So right now we are in declaration mode. We have a variable named username with a value of undefined because it was defined using var. We have another variable name, that is number. It will not be initialized because the way it is created is using let. So once it is done, we'll move on to line number 9 and we'll see we have another variable declaration called pi, and this is declared using const. So const will do the same thing here. As we can see it, it just creates the box. It doesn't initialize the box. So that's why at this point of time, we have a variable named username with a value of undefined because it was defined with var. And in these two cases, it is not initialized with any value. So these two variables are empty right now. So declaration mode is over. We'll move on to the next phase, that is execution phase. So in execution phase, we look for function execution or a value assigned to a variable. So on line number 1, we can see it is saying console.log. It's a function execution. So as soon as that happens, it will create an execution context. So this is the execution context of function. Inside that, we are looking for a variable named username. So we'll go into the memory looking for the variable. Will we find it? No. And when we do not find it, we'll bubble out to the parent. In the parent, we'll see we have a variable named username and the value is initialized to undefined. And because you can only use a variable when it is initialized, so in log, we'll see the message undefined. So I'll go ahead and write the message undefined here. As soon as that happens, the execution context will be deleted. And we'll move on to line number 2. And here again, we can see there is a function execution, console log. So we'll execute the function again. In the execution, we are looking for the variable number. So we'll go into the memory looking for the variable number. We'll not be able to. So once we do not find the variable number, we'll move out to the parent. And here we can see that we have a variable declaration number. But the point is, this variable is not initialized with any value. We need to repeat the rule again. You cannot use a variable that is not initialized. And this variable is not initialized. And that's why what will happen is this execution here will throw an error saying you cannot use a variable that is not initialized. And that is how a variable defined with var, let and const behaves differently. The same thing will happen when it comes to line number 3, where we are saying console log by. Say for example, if we move this line on top, here what will happen? It will create an execution context. In the execution context, it will be looking for the variable pi. So it'll look into the memory, it will not be able to find it. It will bubble out to the parent. And here, it will find the variable name pi. But the important thing to notice is you cannot use a variable that is not initialized. This variable is not initialized, so it will throw an error. You cannot use a variable that is not initialized. So now what we can do, we can go ahead and try executing this code in console to see the error message. So I'll open console and we'll paste the same code here. So we know that username is going to be undefined. That was our output. And number will throw an error saying number cannot be used before initialization. Press enter and we can see the first output, that is undefined, as we have noticed because the variable is defined using var, and var creates the box. Along with that, it also initializes the box with the value undefined. In the second case, when we are saying console log pi, it is saying cannot access pi before initialization. And this is the rule. You cannot access a variable before initialization. So we saw the output here. So you cannot use /access a variable that is not initialized. And that happens because of the reason that when you create a variable using var, it does two things. Creates the box and initializes the box with the value undefined. But let only creates the box. It doesn't initialize the box with any value. So in this way, we understood one of the last differences between var, let and const. Earlier, we have learned about var to be a functional scoped, let and const to be a block scoped and functional scoped. So these are the other differences that we already know. So from now onwards, you should know that when you define a variable with var, it gets hoisted and the value gets initialized with undefined, but it's not the same case that happens with let and const. Because of this reason, you should always consider using let and const over var, because it will prevent to write code where you are accessing a value before defining it. That's not considered to be a good practice.